Well, hello and welcome to our Bible study. We are continuing our discussion of the book of Luke, parables that we find in the Gospel of Luke. And today's lesson, number 10, is How Much Can God Trust You? We're going to be looking at the parable of the sometimes called shrewd manager, sometimes called unjust steward or unfaithful steward. There may be a couple of other names in there that you'll find. I dubbed this at the end of last lesson as the most difficult of Jesus' parables to interpret. We'll look at that, and I'm in good company. If you look behind me, over my left shoulder, you see a number of books on a shelf there, and those all have to do with parables, and they all have to do with something related to the Gospel of Luke. And so I comb through those as I prepare for these lessons, and they're pretty much in agreement that this one's right at the top of the list, if not the most difficult, one of the most difficult. And there are a number of reasons why. We'll talk about that as we go forward. When we get done, of course, we'll recognize that Jesus' teaching is clear. The challenges that we face when we look at the connection of what Jesus says in the parables with the way he goes about applying them. Now, I say all of that, and yet if you go to gotquestions.org and look up the question about the parable of the shrewd manager, you'll find that they say it's pretty easy to interpret, pretty easy to think about what the implications and applications are. And yet what they've done is distilled a lot of work to get to the point of just telling you what the thing should say, what the parable should mean. But as you go through the literature, as you go through your own reading of the text in context with what Jesus goes on to say, there are some challenges there, and we want to address those as we go forward. What I want to do is walk you through the text. You saw that our lesson talks about how much can God trust you. We'll come to that at the end. But you also notice that the text goes from Luke 16, verse 1 through 18. Really, the parable itself and its discussion or application go through verse 13. In my outline that I'll show you in a moment, we'll look at all of 1 through 18. We won't talk a lot about verses 14 through 18. There are some applications of Jesus teaching about the law to the Pharisees and so forth. There may be a point to make there, but that's a point at which Luke is trying to extend some of the discussion about Jesus' ministry as he then makes transition to other teachings that will come up later in that chapter. But as we do that, let me go ahead and show you what we're going to find as we look at this text a little bit more closely. Really, we'll see that there are two main divisions, but we'll look at all four for the text. How much can God trust you? Well, that'll be a good question, considering when we see how much the master could or could not trust his steward. Well, the first thing we're going to look at is the parable itself, and that will take us from verse 1 through verse 9. A little bit of question about where to really end the parable, but we'll talk about that as we get to it. And then, even though there is a discussion about what the parable means right at the end, there are continuing implications and applications in verses 10 through 13. It could be that some of these things could stand alone as sayings, but clearly they are given in context with this parable. And then the last few verses, as you'll see if you're following along in the literature that we're using, there is more talk about the Pharisees, and then there is also going to be talk about the law and the prophets with a concluding verse about marriage and adultery. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at what we have here and just make our way through the text. As we do, you may want to go back and look at a couple of the, not just the focal passage, but also go ahead and look at some of the background texts. What we're going to deal with in this text has to do with money. And so a couple of other passages that you may want to look at regarding money and proper understanding of money will be in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. We touched on those a few lessons ago in another context. Then you might want to go and extend that in that same chapter to 1 Timothy 6, verses 17 through 19. And then always we could go to Malachi and look at chapter 3, verse 10. The issue is making sure we recognize, as we'll see in the application, that we are good stewards ourselves of the things that belong to God and that he is simply entrusting to us. So let's go ahead and take a look. First of all, let me talk about verses 1 through 9. And so I want to read that first, and then we'll come back and read the text related to some of the implications and applications. So let's first read chapter 16, verses 1 through 9. And I'll be reading from the Christian Standard Bible. Now he said to his disciples, There was a rich man who received an accusation that his manager was squandering his possessions. So he called the manager in and asked, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you can no longer be my manager." Then the manager said to himself, "What will I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I'm removed from management, people will welcome me into their homes." So he summoned each one of his master's debtors. "How much do you owe my master?" he asked the first one. 100 measures of olive oil, he said. "Take your invoice," he told him. "Sit down quickly and write 50. Next, he asked another, "How much do you owe?" 100 measures of wheat, he said. "Take your invoice," he told him, "and write 80. The master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd than the children of light in dealing with their own people. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of worldly wealth, so that when it fails, they may welcome you into eternal dwellings." Well, if you're listening closely, you note that there are some questions that arise here. One is the nature of the parable itself. Of course, we know what's going on in the parable, and yet what sticks with us is the very end of the parable when we find out what the result is. And if that's not enough, then when we go to listen to what Jesus has to say about basic application and teaching, we're even a little bit more perplexed, because it makes it sound like what Jesus is telling us to do is act like the world. So let's take a look at this passage a little bit more closely, highlight a couple of things of background that may give us some further insight, and then move forward to make the connections between what's going on in the parable, Jesus' teachings, and then later we'll read verses 10 through 13 about some other applications. First to note is that Luke is very clear to us that that Jesus is talking to his disciples. Again, we don't want to lose the full context here. Jesus has just been spending chapter 15 with the three lost parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And now, very quickly, it says that Jesus is now talking to his disciples. And so he's giving a word to them. And as he does, we're going to see how he's then going to teach the disciples about the way they should act in the world. So notice that he's talking to the disciples. As we look at verse 14 at the very end, real quickly, it is very clear that it's in the earshot of the Pharisees, and that's to be expected. The parables that were in chapter 15 were to the Pharisees and the scribes when they were talking about Jesus' attitude toward the tax collectors and sinners. The question that arises as we read the text, and I just want to bring the text up again and walk through it, is what's going on in these characters? Is there any representation that we should think about? What should we make of this? So first words out of the parable, Jesus says this: "There was a rich man who received an accusation that his manager was squandering his possessions." The rich man, of course, is a major landowner. We'll see the rest of the parable. Those that are in debt to the rich man will in some way be in contract with them, and that what the manager does, and it's literally a word for a person who manages a household, who owns or runs the house, if you will, is basically his intermediary. He's the rich man's intermediary and can actually stand in for him whenever is necessary with business dealings. And so what happens is, we don't know all the backstory. We don't know even if the accusations are true, but the man calls in his manager and says, "I've been receiving accusations against you." The accusation in some way is that he is squandering his possessions. Now, the he is the manager, and the other he, his possessions, is the rich man. Curious enough, the word squandering there is the same word that is used of the lost son when he took his father's inheritance and then went off to a distant land. It said, and he squandered all of his money. Same thing is going on here. He just kind of divided it and it was gone. Now, what does that mean in this context? The details aren't that significant, but we do know that what it was involved something that was in some fraudulent manner done against his boss. He's thinking of himself. Who knows if it's embezzlement? Who knows if it's maybe skimming off the top? We just know that he's not being a good manager. He's not acting in the best interest of his boss. So we don't know all that it entails. We just know that he's squandering his possessions. Verse 2, having heard about the problem, he calls in the manager and he says, so he called the manager in and asked, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you can no longer be my manager. Again, some of the translations are going to say steward or servant of some kind. It is, as we said, a manager, someone who manages a household, if you will. And then you can just see the play on words there. Tell me about your management. You're not going to be my manager any longer. Give me an account. What is this I hear about you? He's giving the man an opportunity to tell him what he's doing, or maybe even give justification for what he's doing. Being confronted, though, we are not told, or being confronted, the man does not respond directly to his boss. Are the accusations true? It's up in the air. I would assume that they are, but what is in the text here is that he's given the opportunity to make an account. Now, when he's told that he can give an account or should give an account, and then he's also telling the manager that he's no longer going to be his manager, we don't know if that firing, if you will, being released of his duties is immediate, or if he's sending him back to get all of the documentation that he needs in order to make an account for what he's been doing. It may be that there's an opportunity that the manager is, or the master is giving him, even though he's made the decision that he's no longer going to be a manager. Well, verse 3 continues, the manager said to himself, apparently he's left now, he's talking to himself, and he's thinking, what am I going to do? And he thinks about his options. One, he's been a manager, obviously, quote, what we would call today a white collar job. And if he's losing this job, then he knows his options are going to be limited. Maybe he's going to get blackballed in the community based on what he's done with this boss. He won't be able to have the same kind of job somewhere else. But he's thinking about a couple of things. His options are to go and dig, do manual labor. But he says to himself, I'm not strong enough to do that. And then he also said something interesting. He's ashamed to beg. Now, that would have been an option, clearly. It would have been something that would have been well beneath him, given his current status in the community. He's already also known in the community as a manager of a very wealthy man. And of course, for him to be seen in the streets begging, that would bring extra shame on him. So he's thinking about that. Not always about the truth here, but about what's going to make him look good. He's not strong enough to dig because he's been working as a manager, and he's certainly ashamed to beg. So the interpretive question again is, what was he doing with his boss's clients in order to be fraudulent or to be mismanaging or squandering the possessions of his boss? We don't know all of that. We will have to look into that a little bit more as we go through. Does he leave? What is his plan? He knows whatever he's going to do is self-interest. It's all in his own self-interest. And so as he's asked himself the question, in verse 4, he comes up with the answer. I know what I'll do. He says, what I can do when I'm removed from management will help me so that I can get into other people's homes. He says in verse 4, I know what I will do so that when I'm removed from management, he knows that's coming, it's impending, he's already told he's lost his job. He says, I'll do this so that people will come to me or welcome me into their homes. He's going to do something for others in some way that will act as putting others in a position of having to pay him back at some point. So while he's not been removed yet, he's made plans for when he is removed. Maybe what we can say then is he has developed his exit strategy. The question is that what he is legitimately doing? And is that the teaching that Jesus is trying to give us at this point? He goes, and in verse 5, he summons one of the master's debtors. Now, we don't know how many he is eventually doing. I mean, the parable doesn't give us all the details. We don't know how many people he is going to work with in order to do this, but Jesus' parable gives us two examples. So it does say in general that he goes to each one of his master's debtors. And of course, he would have been involved in that as the intermediary, as the one who would represent the master. And so he knows who is indebted and what the level of indebtedness is and so forth. But what Jesus does in the parable, it gives us two examples. First, he says to the first one, tell me what you owe my master. And the first one says, I owe 100 measures of olive oil. Now, many of your other translations are going to say baths. And just to break it down real quickly, what you're seeing here is something on the order of maybe 850 gallons, 800 to 900 gallons of olive oil. The issue there is not going to be so much about how much the oil is, but how much it's worth. What the man says then to the man who is indebted to the master, he says, okay, take out the invoice, the grammata there, just take out your note. And he says, now make a change. Rather than it saying 100, change it to 50. Now, he's not going to do it himself. He knows he's fired. It's got to be in the handwriting of the man who's got the contract with the master. We'll come back a little bit more what's going on there in a moment. At least there are some speculations about that. Then in verse 7, we're told he goes to another person and he asks him, how much do you owe? And the man says, well, I owe 100 measures of wheat. Measures there is the word for cores. And what we're looking at there is about 1,100 bushels of wheat, a large amount again. He says, now you take out your note, you take out your invoice and you scratch out 100 and you put 80. So what is going on here? Certainly we have two examples of probably many where the manager tells a debtor, change the amount that you owe. And of course, there are a couple of things that will result from that, but there are also a couple of other things that we're looking at. The question is, who are these debtors? Some have suggested perhaps that they would be people who would have bought this material from the master and as a wholesaler will be selling that to others. They're certainly not peasants. They are ones that are in charge of running the business themselves. Some have suggested that what they are people who have contracted with the master to run the land, and it's a large enough amount that ultimately they would give back a large portion of that to the master. We've seen parables that have dealt with that before. Remember, there's a parable about the unjust stewards in the sense that the master owned some land, and when the people that were working the land were supposed to pay back to the owner, they wouldn't. And so he sent different business representatives, and ultimately he sent his son. And of course, in the parable, they killed the son, of course, representative of God sending his son. And so this was a real life type situation in this parable. It's likely then that these are managers of large plots of land, and it would be their job to then give the portion, a certain portion, to the master at harvest time. And so what we see here is people that are indebted as fairly wealthy workers themselves. Well, what's going on then with the debt? What's happening here? Why is one's debt reduced by 50% and the other one's debt is reduced by 20%? What is happening there? A couple of questions that come up, or a couple of options that come up. One is that maybe this was the amount of interest that would have been applied to the debt. And when the man tells him, drop down the amount that you owe just to basically the principal, that your baby there, the issues that he's removing the interest. And what he's going to be doing in doing so is in a sense making his boss look good, because it would not have been proper Jewish practice to charge interest like that. And so what this man is doing is basically putting a good word in for his boss, if that's what's going on here. It may not be. So it may be that what he's doing is he's saying, drop the interest. Now the question would be, why is interest so high on one and not as much on the other? There's another explanation we'll look at. Some have suggested that what's going on here is that the man is basically saying, I'm dropping my commission. And to what extent the man was able to collect a commission on what he was managing is hard to say. But if he is, again, the question is, why is the commission different? Well, probably has a lot to do with the value of what is owed. One is olive oil and the other is wheat. Another option, and this might be the best option, is to think that what we have here is in terms of how much in terms of value was being deleted. What you see here is essentially two different products at two different values, and that they both equal about 2 years worth of wages, about 2 years worth of day wages, if I can say it, day laborers' wages. We're talking about somewhere in the order of a little over 500, almost 600 or more denarii. And what that means then is the oil was worth more, of course, and then the wheat. So what he's doing is he's cutting down still a significant amount, but it's the same amount of days of labor work. We're digging into the details, I know, but it does raise the question of what is this man doing? What is going on? He is already in trouble with his boss. In fact, he's lost his job, and now he's only requiring the debtors to pay back a portion of what is owed. And we can assume at this point that the amount that's owed is the 100 measures of olive oil and 100 measures of wheat. What is going on that the man is going to be cutting down how much is owed? Well, we know this much. His motive is to set himself up so that when he loses his job permanently, he would be in the good graces of some, that he'll have a place to stay. That way he wouldn't have to dig, he wouldn't have to beg. They might take him into their home as a payback for what he's done for them. Now, one of the challenges we have here, of course, is we have an owner who is not being judged at this point. And there are those that interpret this passage that suggest that the rich man is evil himself, and what the man who is working for him is doing, even though he's also evil, is he's going to make his boss look good, because it would have been wrong to charge interest or whatever. It's hard to say. I don't see anything in here that would suggest that the rich man, the owner, is evil. He does have an interesting character, though, as we'll see in response to what the manager does. But what the man is doing, of course, is taking care of himself. And you probably know people that doesn't matter what happens, they're going to turn something around to their advantage. They're going to be looking out for themselves, and they might even make themselves the victim in many respects. Another thing he's doing is perhaps setting himself up so that if he was ever able to be in a business, he has business partners or he has clients that he can go to. And you've seen it in the movies, and you've probably seen it in real life. Someone works for a firm, whether it's a business firm or a law firm or some kind of partnership, real estate, who knows. And when they get ready to leave that company, they try to get in the good graces of some of the clients so that when that person opens up his or her own office, they might be enticed to go see him or her. Here, we definitely know what the man is doing, though, is he's trying to get a quid pro quo situation started. In other words, when he's gone, they might be willing to take him or they would be willing to take him into their home and maybe employ him in some way. As the parable progresses, you have to be thinking, if we read slowly and if we read without any expectation or any knowledge of the text, you might be thinking, this is Jesus giving a parable. We have the master, who a lot of times in these parables is God. And then you're expecting the worst. You're expecting what is to follow to be some further judgment about the character of this manager. And yet, when we read verse 8, we're totally thrown off in another direction. It says in verse 8, the master praised the unrighteous manager because he acted shrewdly. Some translations will say wisely. The word that's actually used there is the word for being thoughtful. We'll talk about that in a second. But when you get to this point in the parable, and it's almost a total redirect, if you will. He praises the unrighteous manager, and you're just thinking, why? Why are you doing that? He's already been squandering your possessions, and now he's undercutting you in some form or fashion. Even though one interpretation is that he makes the master look good. Who knows? Maybe one of the interpretations, as we said, is that the master was probably charging interest and he shouldn't be, and what the manager is doing is at least making the owner look good now, so that maybe there'll be a recommendation in his future. Who knows? It just doesn't look good. And when you think about both the squandering of possessions and now the undercutting, if you will, you're expecting the master to criticize or ridicule or maybe publicly shame the manager, and yet he doesn't. He praises him. He lauds him for acting shrewdly. Now, of course, the question arises, was he acting shrewdly at the squandering, or is he acting shrewdly now? I think the main issue here is that he is praising him for the way he's acted since he's lost his job. And it still doesn't make sense. It's not something that I would necessarily do. It's certainly unexpected. He'd already squandered the master's business, maybe capital, or something along those lines. And certainly now the owner knows he's not getting back as much that is owed to him. So the question that arises, the master praises the manager, but does he praise him? Or will the praise lead to reinstatement is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't seem like it will be. We're kind of cut off at the end there because Jesus is about to step in as no longer narrator, but teacher again, and give us further information, which is, again, going to be a little bit more problematic. But I would ask this question: if it were you, what would you do? How would you respond as the shrewd manager? How would you respond as the owner? It's very difficult. We do have our moral sensibilities about us. And yet in the story, the owner praises the manager. It just seems to go against what we would expect to be a proper thing. Now, the other thing that we have going for us, though, without reading further yet, we might think, okay, Jesus is going to get him here. He's going to tell us something about this parable that would indicate to us this is the kind of character you should not have. And yet when you read what he has to say, he speaks in such a way that it sounds like we should act this way. But the question is that really what he's trying to do? Is that really what's going on? If anything, what the master looks to the manager and says, in our modern way of saying, is we might say something like this: well played, well played. There's some sense in which he's giving some kind of acknowledgement to the shrewd manager that, yep, you kind of got me, and now I'm in a position where I can't really criticize you because then that would still make me look bad in some way. And so he leaves it up to that. So where are we going with this? Well, we do know that there's an application coming. Sometimes Jesus gives us application and teaching. Sometimes he leaves it there and we're able to figure out what is meant in the context. We do get a further statement from Jesus at this point. And so I will look at that in a moment. But again, would you have been tempted or motivated or even try to be shrewd enough to be like this manager? Some of us might have been. We have to think about it real carefully. When we're thinking about our self-preservation, how might we act in that situation? And again, given the response of the master, what is your response to the master at this point? Do you think that he is being fair? Do you think you should have hired him back? Or should you told him, what are you even doing going after the clients that we have now? You have been fired already. I know it's a parable. I know we have to be careful not to read too much into it. We have to be careful of not allegorizing. We do know there's an analogy going on here, and we'll see. But it is interesting to kind of figure out what's going on culturally and practically here. When it came to thinking about his master's things, the manager squandered everything. And yet when it came to thinking about his own situation, he acted shrewdly. He acted thoughtfully and creatively. It is the word there that meant he put thought into it. He gave consideration to, he put his mind to something. And he did that knowing what his future might be, or he's doing the best that he can in order to make a better future for himself. Let's move on to what Jesus goes on to say. Verse 8, of course, opens up with the conclusion of the parable itself, where Jesus then says that the master praised the man for acting shrewdly. And now at the end of verse 8 and into verse 9, we're seeing kind of a roundup of what the text is trying to say, what Jesus is trying to communicate to us from the text. He goes on in verse 8b through 9 and says this: for the children of this age are more shrewd than the children of light in dealing with their own people. Let's stop and talk about that for a moment. When he says for children of this age are more shrewd than children of light in dealing with their own people, right on the top of things, it sounds like what Jesus is saying is, you as my believers aren't shrewd. And we do know that Jesus at one point said that it would be important for us to be shrewd as serpents, but yet gentle as doves and so forth. But it sounds like what Jesus is about to say here has to do with the fact that maybe we need to be more shrewd in the sense of applying some of the ways the world acts. They come off smarter than us sometimes. They come off more, well, the word shrewd just keeps coming to mind, of course, but they're more thoughtful. They're more creative. They dig deep and think hard about things. They maybe think about their own self-preservation. There is a comparison here between the children of this age and the children of light in dealing with their own people. Now, what may be going on here is saying this, that the people of this age, in other words, the people of the world, those apart from God, are putting their mind to evil things, and they're putting more thought into that than what children of the light have been doing with regard to what they need to do in order to put the kingdom practices in right order, or to put into practice the things related to the kingdom. It literally does say their own, or their own people. Some are going to say that what Jesus is doing is picking up on a phrase because it's found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's found among the Essene literature, that the children of light would represent a later time period. That might be, but more than likely what Jesus is doing is using the phrase children of light to represent the people who belong to the kingdom, and that while they still live in this age, they need to be thinking about how they can put forth the work of the coming age, because with the coming of Jesus, we have the breaking in of the kingdom, yet we'll have the consummation of the kingdom at the end of the age. But it does seem like Jesus is giving a criticism here. The man is praised for his shrewdness. Then Jesus turns around and says, for the children of this age are more shrewd than children of the light, dealing with their own people. It is an interesting statement there in contrast. And so with that, you're just left with thinking, does he want us to act shrewdly in a sense that we manipulate and take advantage of other people? What is he saying here? Verse 9, and I tell you, and this doesn't help us much until we look a little bit deeper. He says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of worldly wealth, so that when it fails, they may welcome you into eternal dwellings. Let's break that down a little bit as well. Make friends for yourselves by means of worldly wealth, so that when it fails, they may welcome you into eternal dwellings. First, make friends for yourselves by means of worldly wealth. The word there for worldly wealth is the word for mammon, and it's the word worldly there is really a word that has to do with unrighteous. Okay, what's he talking about? Is he saying that we would use money to buy off people? No, more than likely what's going on here, as we'll see as we see it carried out with verses 10 through 13, he's talking about taking that which can be used for evil. When he talks about worldly wealth, he's not saying that money is evil, but money is a temptation for evil. What we need to do is use the resources that are provided in the world to make friends. Now, what he means by make friends there isn't, again, manipulating, it's not bribing people for the kingdom, but it is used, as many will write in their applications of this text, that we would use what medium of exchange that the world uses in order to help people, in order to bring about good ministries for people, in order to spread the gospel, in order to help other people in need. Take that which the world uses as a medium of exchange and use it for the kingdom of God. And when it fails, the question is, what does that mean? It literally means when it's gone. Does that mean when the money's gone, or when I'm personally gone, or when the kingdom has come, or when the world has gone away? What does it mean? Likely he's talking about the end of the age, when it's gone, talking about the money that will all go away. Everything will change when the kingdom comes. Then he says they will welcome you into eternal dwellings. A couple things about that. You do see a parallel there with what the shrewd manager was doing. He thought by taking care of his boss's clients, the debtors, that they would welcome him into their dwelling. Here, what Jesus says is there's an eternal dwelling for those who are going to be faithful to God in using the material resources that they have in order to further the kingdom. The they is more than likely kind of another way of saying God and his kingdom. And the eternal dwelling there is the eternal tabernacles, which is kind of an interesting language you find in the Old Testament about the dwelling places of God. And so what we're seeing here is Jesus saying that we have, on the one hand, this shrewd manager who was self-preserving, and he did put a lot of thought into it, probably put a lot of thought into what he was doing and squandering his boss's possessions as well. But what he's saying here is what we would call an implied how much more parable. We've talked about these from greater or from lesser to greater parables before, where Jesus gives an example and then says how much more. So Jesus on prayer, talking about asking and seeking, and he says, well, two of you among you, you fathers would, if your son asked for a fish, would give them a snake, and ask for bread, would give them a rock. He says, if you being evil fathers know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father give you the Spirit when you ask. And of course, that's the version in Luke. We'll find other places later in Luke 18 when Jesus gives the parable about the unjust judge. And eventually, the judge will give justice to the elderly lady. Jesus says, how much more will God show you justice, show you righteousness, and come to advocate for you? What's curious about this particular one is it's the opposite. In each of the other examples, there was that one, and there was also the friend who was bothered at night. He eventually gave help to his friend because he kept bugging him. Jesus goes on to say, how much more will God be willing to help you? In each of those examples, there is a positive illustration followed by the how much more. In this case, we have a negative illustration. We have a person who is wicked, who is squandering, who is maybe stealing from his boss, and certainly maybe we would say even cooking the books, if you will, finding a way to embezzle. We don't know all the crimes. And yet, as he's about to lose his job, he acts in such a way as to seemingly do more harm to his boss. We see the boss praise him. And the only thing I can think about there, and of course, Jesus doesn't tell us everything. The only thing I can think there is, even as a worldly person, he doesn't have the moral standard to really ridicule and condemn the man publicly. He just kind of takes it as, well, you got me there. Well played. You're expecting that Jesus then would come back with a direct statement, clear, saying, don't do that. Don't act like that. Eventually, that's what he's intending, but he's implying it. And this is what we would say is an implied how much more parable. The world acts this way. We might call that wise in terms of how they go about making decisions. God has, by our being created, we have the same minds, we have the same capabilities, but how much more should we be using that for the good of the kingdom? So it's one of those implied how much mores. Still, you wish, at least I do, and I know it's still Jesus' own saying, and he can teach the way he wants. You would have thought perhaps what he could have done is given a parable of a positive example and still said, how much more should we be doing that? He does completely the opposite. Maybe he does that because he has seen, and he knows the people around him have seen the way the world acts and the way the world engages in these business practices, and says you should be doing just the opposite, but doing the opposite in even more exuberant, if you will, ways, being more generous and so forth. And that's one of the ways that people will understand this text, is that we will take these worldly means of wealth, this worldly mammon, and we will make it useful for the kingdom, but doing it in even more abundant ways. Well, you have there the parable and a general teaching that derives from it. But then what Jesus goes on to do is offer up three statements about faithfulness, and then a fourth statement by way of application. But I just want to kind of sum up what Klein Snodgrass says in his book on parables, Stories with Intent. He says this in terms of a paraphrase of what to do with this parable and some of what the teaching is. He says this: put yourself in a good position through your start over. Put yourself in a good position through your use of money, which so easily leads you astray. And that's why we said, when we said worldly wealth, the idea is that money is not bad, but it can be tempting to be bad. He's saying that which might be tempted, use it for good, harness it for good. Put yourself in a good position through your use of money, which so easily leads you astray, so that when this age is over, and that's where he's saying when this fails or when it goes away, when this age is over, God will receive you into his eternal dwelling. And he's taking there the idea that the word they will receive you into eternal dwellings is kind of a euphemism or a paraphrase for God and his court. We are to use the time that we have and the resources that we have been provided to reflect the current inbreaking of the kingdom, and in the context and with the prospect of the consummation of the kingdom. What we should be doing then in the time being before the kingdom is consummated is doing everything we can to bring people into the kingdom. And that means helping them with their physical needs and with their spiritual needs. Jesus said to make friends. The idea of making friends there is more of the idea of basically trying to bring people into the kingdom. What are further implications and applications? We'll conclude with these, and then just a touch on a brief moment about verses 14 to 18. Notice what he's going to say here in these last few phrases. He's going to talk about being faithful. Notice the first one. He says, we first of all need to be faithful with little things. That will demonstrate our faithfulness with other things. He says, whoever is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And whoever is unrighteous in very little is also unrighteous in much. He's making a general statement. And if you think about it, he's using that as a motivation for us to be faithful, demonstrate our faithfulness so that more will be upon us. But then notice what he does, in many ways reflective of what went on in the parable. The one who is unrighteous in little things, like this manager, demonstrates himself to be unrighteous even more so when confronted. Jesus is calling us to faithfulness. Now, as we look at the word mammon, we look at the word faithfulness, and we look at some other words related here. You don't see it even in the original Greek, but some have suggested what Jesus is doing by connecting these last three statements with the parable is that there is the word for mammon, that there are different words built on the same root in Aramaic that will kind of tie all this together, that a contemporary of Jesus would understand what's going on there. We lose that in our translation. Fortunately, we do have the issue of faithfulness that ties in along the way. So he says first about those who are faithful with little. Then he talks about those who, in the opposite way, who are not faithful. He says, if you have not been faithful in the worldly wealth, who will trust you with what is genuine? And that ties back in with the parable as well. The idea of worldly wealth. Whoever's not faithful with the things of this world, how are you going to be trusted when the real comes? And notice again that the manager manipulated worldly wealth for evil. We need to be using the worldly wealth. We need to be using the resources that we have in the world to further the kingdom. And then lastly, he says, not being faithful with someone else's stuff. And this is where it really makes a connection with us in the parable with our relationship with God. Verse 12, he says, and if you have not been faithful with what belongs to someone else, who will give you what is your own? The man in the parable was not faithful with his master's possessions. And of course, he lost his job over it. Jesus is telling us to be faithful with what belongs to God. Even the worldly wealth, we know it's wealth and that takes place in the resources that we have in the world, but everything belongs to God, and we can use it for his benefit. Where is the reward if we're not faithful with what God has provided? So he goes on to say, even as the manager was not faithful with his master's money, we face the temptation of not being faithful with what God has provided us, and we need to be faithful with that. And then this last statement in verse 13 seems a little bit difficult to connect, but I think there's a way to connect it. He says in verse 13, no servant can serve two masters, since either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And there's where the word mammon comes in again. Mammon is really basically possessions and things that are of the world. And so it can be used for money, it can be used for possessions and so forth. What's going on? How does this fit? Well, we do know this text comes up in Matthew as well in a different context, but there's a way to connect it here. I think one way to do it is to recognize who our master is and be faithful with the things that he has provided, and not being caught up into the material things. You're eventually going to be served, or you are, going to serve one or the other. In other words, you can end up becoming in servitude to money and to possessions, or in a good way, you will submit yourself in servitude to God, but you can't do both. He says you will either hate one and love the other, or flip it around. He says in the other order, be devoted to one and despise the other. There's no way that you can split your loyalties like that. What I think you can do, though, is you can take the one, the mammon, as a means to serve God. Rather than being a slave to materialism, a slave to money, what we can do is use what is provided to us because it belongs to God and give it in service to him. We have the exhortation then in the opposite. Jesus gives us a very, very negative parable, and then he turns it around so that he shows us how we are to act. I don't know that I've necessarily resolved the issues. Maybe you looked at this parable and thought, I never saw a problem with it in the first place. Well, I'm happy for you. The challenge, though, is I think I'm in pretty good company when I look back on first reading it and then looking at others who have listed multiple different ways to interpret the text, multiple ways to try and figure out what the ultimate application is. We do have to struggle with the fact that what Jesus is doing is tying in these other sayings after the parable. And I think what we have here is a way of Jesus then saying, you need to be using wisdom for the kingdom and not wisdom that is going to lead to selfishness or what is basically found in the world. One question, though, why does Jesus even bring this up? We just had a good series of parables about God's love for everybody, that he desires relationship with them, and yet he turns to his disciples. Well, he turns to his disciples because while God's love is strong for them and desires relationship, they need to be faithful and use the proper resources to spread the kingdom, because Jesus will not be with them all the while. And as we said, at the end, after this, we see in verse 14 that the Pharisees were there. And so real quickly, I just want to tie this in together before we conclude. We do know the Pharisees. They were lovers of money. Verses 14 and 15, they're hearing this and they're not liking what they're hearing. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and scoffing at him. And he told them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts, for what is highly admired by people is revolting in God's sight. One way that this parable could work is, while it may not be a direct statement at what the Pharisees do, certainly it is a direct statement that understands the heart of the Pharisee. They had a tendency as well to look at wealth. Now, that was probably more true of the Sadducees than the Pharisees, but notice Jesus' statement here. You want to scoff at me about what I'm saying, but the point is, as Luke points out, they certainly had an issue with money. So you have a set of parables in Luke 15, which talked about the fact that the Pharisees were not accepting of the tax collectors and sinners, even though they were coming to God in repentance. Here, there's another parable that, while it's directed at the disciples, there is the application for the Pharisees as well. It touches on part of their attitude. Well, then in verses 16 through 18, we have just a general statement about the law continuing. Jesus says the law and the prophets were until John. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God has been proclaimed, and everyone is urgently invited to enter it. We don't have time to get into that text, but some translations will say violently entering it, or entering it with it violently or with violence. There's certainly an eagerness to what's going on here. If anything, one of the things that Jesus is talking about is how expansive this kingdom is in such a short time. But he's definitely telling the Pharisees that, yes, there was the law and the prophets till John. Now the kingdom, however, that doesn't put an end to the law as of yet. He says in verse 17, it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter in the law to drop out. What he's demonstrating is, you talk about being part of the law, you need to obey it. And then this seems rather odd, verse 18. He goes on to talk about this. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery, and everyone who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. Now, I think what's primarily going on here is that's an example that the law is still in effect and it's still going to be in there. And that may be a side note to the Pharisees about their attitude toward divorce. And in some way, what Jesus could be saying is, you're worried about this over here with me talking to my disciples about the use of money and so forth. You've got other things you have to worry about. That's not the easiest explanation. It doesn't seem to fit perfectly in there, but what we see Jesus doing is providing a specific example that this law still needs to be obeyed, and the Pharisees have found different ways that they can get out of abiding by the law. We will see moving forward another parable. What we'll see later is the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee. There are other parables that we'll see that we won't be able to study in this set of lessons, but you'll be able to see in the book of Acts or book of Luke that again target what the Pharisees are doing. And so Jesus is not going to let up. He's going to continue to offer up parables that will get their attention and call them out for their indiscretions and their lack of consistency in what they claim to be a relationship with God that doesn't follow through with external actions. And this may just be another one of those that we're seeing here. So what do we do? Well, certainly this is not Jesus' version of how to win friends and influence people, but certainly it is a sense in which what we would do is take what we have, what God has provided for us, and be able to use it to further his kingdom. As one of those how much more teachings, we can see him flip it around and say, as evil as they are with the way they handle money and the way they handle their business practices, on the flip side, on the complete opposite, we should surpass them in goodness in using what resources we have for the kingdom. We should be taking all that we have in wisdom and applying it in a good way, and in a way that is excessive compared to the way that the world uses evil or uses the resources for evil. We want to be thinking about how we can take what God has given us and use it for good. He is a generous God, and we want to be generous people as well, to bring in as many people as possible. Well, it's been a challenging lesson. It's been one that hopefully has been meaningful. I want to challenge you to continue to read through that text, draw out implications for yourself, and think about what it is that you can do to be resourceful in helping others spread the gospel if you can't go yourself, where you can put your money in helping people spread the gospel, where you can put your time and energy and prayer and resources into helping someone who needs food, helping someone who needs healing of physical ailments. Definitely, most importantly, what can we do to be sharing the gospel with others, and how we can resource others so that they can be where they are sharing the gospel with others, so that there will be a place for them, and we will know about our reward in heaven in being faithful to what God has called us to. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word, and we know there are times when it's difficult to understand. We know your original audience understood this text. I do thank you for those who have studied the word deeply to be able to understand what is going on with this text and how we can apply it and understand it. I pray that you will help us to be wise with the resources you've provided. I pray that you will help us to be focused on making friends, to share the gospel with them, to know that you love them, so that they will be drawn to you. I pray, Father, that you will help us to take the resources we have, the money that you've provided for us through our jobs and through other means, to provide for the kingdom, to bring people into the kingdom. You're a good God, and we thank you for being generous with us in your grace. Help us to be generous in sharing the gospel as well. You're a good God. We want to worship you. And I do pray, Father, that you will help us to understand our place in your kingdom and to fulfill your purpose in our lives. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, again, won't show the slide for next week, but I'll at least give you the title of the lesson and the references that we're going to look at, and a brief statement about what it is. The lesson title next lesson, is The Peril of Proud Praying. And we're looking at a short passage. It's Luke 18, verses 9 to 14, but it's a familiar parable, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and the issue of who is actually justified. In other words, demonstrates their right position in God when they leave that time of prayer. Well, I hope that you'll have a good week. Pray that you will be diligent in your relationship with God, to be growing, and that you will continue to walk daily with him. And as always, I pray that until next lesson, you will be well and you will be blessed.